Welcome back to another episode of Unleashing the Future of Work, a guide live podcast slash B2B jam session. Super excited about our guest that we have on today. And before I get into who it is, it's a surprise. It's truly a surprise. Want to show love to everyone that's currently tuning in right now. Hope you're having a happy Monday. Usually, I'm always chiming in from California, and it's the same today. I'm chiming in from California, Oakland specifically. So, Oakland, where you at? If you are tuning in from Oakland, show us some love in the comments. If you're tuning in from San Francisco, show us some love in the comments. If you're tuning in from the UK, show us some love in the comments. And in fact, our guest for today is I believe he's beaming in from the UK, unless he's traveled. I think that's where he was at the last time I talked to him, but he'll let us know. But he's an awesome business leader. Today, I'm speaking with Gagan Biyani, who's an entrepreneur, business leader, and former co-founder of Udemy, and the CEO of Sprig, the former CEO of Sprig. And he'll tell you a little bit about that journey. We're going to be talking about entrepreneurship today, as well as his thoughts on education reform, what the industry in terms of the tech industry should be focused on when it comes to gender parity and inclusivity and equity, as well as the behavior shifts that we're seeing in a post-COVID-19 future. We're going to talk about a lot of different things, and it's going to be a really enjoyable conversation. I've had the pleasure of talking with Gagan in past conversations, and this guy is just brilliant, let me tell you, okay? So definitely get excited. If you have any questions for either of us, let us know in the comments. We'll engage with you. We'll show you some love, all right? With that said, let me show love to Angel, who's tuning in. Andrea, who's tuning in from Italy. What's up, Andrea? What's up, Angel? Angel, how are you? Hope you're well. Francesca, Puerto Rico. You need to bring me out to Puerto Rico, Francesca. I would love to come to Puerto Rico. And shout out to Angel as well, who's tuning in from San Jose, California. Much love, much love. And we have a LinkedIn user who's saying he or she's tuning in from Guadalajara, Mexico. Guadalajara, Mexico, which is a long ways away. Thank y'all so much for tuning in with us. With that said, Gagan, what's up, man?
Hey, how's it going, Tim?
It's going well. Where are you tuning in from? Where are you beaming in and joining us from today, man?
Oxford, UK.
Oxford, UK. Dude, how did you get there during the pandemic?
I got here I've been here for about a year now.
Wow.
Usually I was on and off. So I was obviously before the pandemic, I was traveling between the UK and the US. My girlfriend's doing her MBA here.
Wow.
But during the pandemic, we spent about 3 months in the US, and then we came here to spend about 3 months here. So we took a flight to get here.
Well, thank you so much for finding time to, spend time with us while you're in Oxford, UK, man. Would love for you to share with us a little bit about your background. So formerly you were the co-founder of Udemy, one of the hottest, education tech startups of the last 10 years. But I would love for you to kind of take us back before that. Who was Gagan? What was he doing before he was this rock star entrepreneur?
10 years ago, it's even more now. Geez, it's like 2008 is really what you're talking about if you want to know before Udemy. I had just graduated from UC Berkeley. I was a, typical Indian American boy in the Bay Area growing up. So I grew up like 20 minutes from where you live, probably, or 30 max, because I grew up in Fremont.
Right?
Yeah. So I grew up in Fremont, and I went to Berkeley undergrad, and then I graduated and was taking a traditional post economics degree job in consulting for Accenture. And it just so happened that I was bored out of my mind at Accenture, and the economy blew up at the same time. And so it only made it more boring, really. And so I was basically thinking about what I wanted to do next, or what I was going to do to get out of the challenge of not enjoying my work, basically. And I found entrepreneurship. Really, I found it entirely on the internet. So I didn't know anyone who was an entrepreneur. I didn't have any. I had one friend who had started a company in college that was like a local company in Pittsburgh at the school that he was at CMU. That was it. So that's where I started.
Wow, no, that's amazing, man. And it's interesting because we're currently talking with you right now during a current economic downturn as it's been purported, and you started entrepreneurship at around the last economic downturn. I want you to share a little bit about, why you think, people should still take risks on building something or solving big problems that are currently happening in today's age. How do people stay motivated to build businesses, whether it be within an economic downturn or not?
Yeah, I mean, motivation is definitely one of the most difficult things when you're starting a company, because every given day, so on a macro level in your life, it's really hard to want to make that kind of risk. And then every given day, you're dealing with all sorts of challenges and successes and failures, and that roller coaster ride can really be sort of difficult to want to push through. So on the macro level, I mean, when there's a downturn, particularly this type of downturn, the economy changes a lot. Things change in the world at a much faster pace. I mean, we've seen the world fast forward between 3 and 10 years, depending on what industry you're in about 4 months. And so there's a lot of new opportunities that come during a downturn that make it pretty exciting time to start a company. The other thing is, honestly, like, it's harder to get a job. And so if you're someone who was recently out of work, or like me, was kind of sort of forced into work that I wasn't that excited about, not forced labor, I just mean forced as in it was the best option I could find at the time.
Mm.
But if you're someone who isn't thrilled about what they're doing, it's a good time actually to go and try something new. And then finally, I'd say that if you are someone who has a stable job and who is sort of excited about and who isn't excited about that job, this is a time where your work might be, for some people at least, might be slower. For some people, it's a lot busier, and for those people, I don't have an answer for them. But if it's a lot slower, then it's a really good time to do something on the side. And that's definitely
right.
Sorry?
Or pick up new skills on Udemy.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, online education basically fast forwarded 3 years. We saw at Udemy growth that we've never seen. We haven't seen in a few years. This past 2 quarters, and it's primarily driven by the fact that people have, I think, I'm encouraged to see people go back to online education during this time.
Yeah, no, 110%. I want to get your thoughts on education reform, because we're actually seeing a lot of conversation around universities now thinking about how do we go ahead and adapt to this online education model. What do you think needs to be done for university schools, and I think the broader workforce, to start embracing online learning and e-learning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that they will embrace online learning because that's what they've been that's sort of what they've been forced into. So if you take a look at here at Oxford, and this is true at universities all over the world, they don't know if they're going to have classes in the fall. They don't have they have students who are going to come in, and they don't know what the format's going to be like and how they're going to do it. And they've just spent the last 6 months roughly doing courses entirely remote. So I don't think the question is about whether or not they'll move into online learning. The question is whether they'll be good at it and whether it'll still be worth the value that they have provided. And I think that fortunately, this has created an opportunity for new entrants to come in and provide an experience that is rethought and is better for students, because I don't think that the modern university serve students in the best way possible. I still think it's a profitable decision to go to college. So I'm still in favor of people going to college and going to graduate school. But I think it's 4 to 10 times worse than what it could be. And so those are very different things. I'm not saying college is bad. I'm just saying that college could be this and it's this. So why are we settling for this? It's not doing a service to everyone. And so my goal is to make it so that college is a lot more valuable in the future, and I think it will be.
Yeah. No, I remember my college experience, man. Most of everything I learned around product management and business was outside of college, 120%. But the experience, the relationships, and I think the exposure to a different, diverse set of people and community changed my life. So I agree with you. And the experience around college, I actually think it's important, but it's how do we embrace kind of, some of the elements of the private sector, and how do we bring that into college campgrounds? It's what I'm more interested in finding more about.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows the statistics or the sort of the theory behind how college doesn't prepare you for the real world, doesn't prepare
Yeah.
you for a job. Um, and it goes way beyond that. College fundamentally is the gatekeeper that prevents anyone else from preparing you from the real world in a good way. So college made sense when it was started, and it honestly still generally makes sense today. It's
Yeah.
this idea that, as humans evolve and as we get smarter and smarter, we need more time for development.
Yeah.
So it used to be people, finish school in the third grade at age 10, or age 9.
Which is crazy.
And right, I mean, that wasn't that long ago, dude.
Yeah.
That was like 100 years ago,
That's
right? Like there were, and still today in some parts of the world, people either don't go to school or they end school in their youth. um, but of course, eventually, as humans had higher life expectancies, and as we got smarter, essentially as a race, we figured out that if we continued our education for longer, we might get more and more sort of personal and professional development during that time, and personal and intellectual development during that time. And college was created as originally for the elite few who
Mm.
were at that level and wanted to have that level, that additional 4 years or 3 years of a liberal arts education. Well, that's not really what most people go to college for today, and we haven't changed it since then. And so my hope is that during this pandemic, people already knew this, but there was no sort of lever that was driving change. There was no catalyst for change. And so the system as it existed was not being questioned sufficiently for people to want an alternative. And now I think we're seeing people demand that alternative, and that's really all we need. We just need a little bit of a spark. And I think that we'll see massive change in the college landscape. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, so you kind of see COVID-19 as that triggering catalyst that is causing a lot of this talk around education reform.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I was really disappointed that this is what caused it. I mean, this is
Yeah, yeah,
horrible. It's like the worst situation you could possibly imagine.
yeah.
That's at least in the modern era. Obviously, there are lots of worse situations. We could be at war, etc. This isn't actually as bad as that, but it's a pretty bad situation given that is causing what I think will be a bunch of positive change. So we will have a lot of negative consequences of this, but it's very clear that the human race is not going to end in the next year as a result of this pandemic. And given that that's true, and those of us, hopefully that'll include both of us, but those of us who survive this and move on to the next phase are going to benefit from the change that is going to occur as a result of this time.
No, that's powerful, man. I want to show love to our amazing community and audience. Shout out to Betty. She's asking, during your time with Udemy, how did Udemy think about partnering with colleges and universities? She's an educator herself, so love to get your thoughts on this, Gagan.
Sure. Thanks, Betty, for the question. I mean, when we started Udemy, we were completely outside the traditional college and education system. So we certainly tried to talk to professors, but we didn't believe that the modern education system was going to be where we got most of our success. And we ended up being right. And then we ended up being very wrong. So we were right in the sense that Gagan Biyani was incapable of convincing any professors to come and join him when he was starting Udemy and teaching and getting people to teach courses. We were wrong in that Coursera and Udacity, because they were from Stanford, started in Stanford campus, they basically were able to get professors to teach online. And so, we kind of missed that trend. But on the flip side, Udemy ended up being very successful because it taught a totally different set of curriculum and skills, right? You can actually go to Udemy and for, between $10 and $100, you can learn everything you need to go and get a new job. And that is not true. Like that is in spite of what universities provide. And so actually we didn't have a lot of success with universities. I don't think they took us very seriously, nor did they really want to sort of partner with a young startup like that. But when their own professors starting putting courses on the internet, all of a sudden they paid attention. And that was a pretty interesting thing to watch happen.
Yeah, they caught on real quick, right? They caught on with the movement. It's crazy, man. And I think we're where it's funny because I think I wonder if professors are concerned right now with this current climate on how they need to change how they educate as teachers. Where everything is shifting back to online. And I'm actually currently working with my alma mater, University of Texas, to think about more how do teachers adapt? How do professors and universities adapt in this current climate? So you really bring up a great point, man.
Yeah, and I mean, so I actually will say that I don't think they caught on that quick. But
Mm,
universities and sort of these sort of elitist institutions are very good at catching on enough that they satiate the desire of the public
mm,
while not catching on enough to the new things that they actually really improve or change the system.
mm.
And I think this happens in politics, and it happens, and you and I talked about this a little bit actually in our pre-call. But this is definitely happening. This definitely happened with Udacity and Coursera. They gave the world enough to sort of hold off innovation for 5 years. I mean, the truth is, what they could have done and what they did do are vastly different. They could have made a much bigger improvement in online in the world than they did, but they did enough to keep people happy and keep people feeling like things are moving.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's actually something I'm worried about right now. I'm worried about watching, I don't think we have a very good alternative today to college and
Mm.
universities. I don't think we can take, the few million students, I believe it's a few million or maybe 500,000 to 1 million students a year who go to universities who start their university education. I don't think we have an alternative place for them to go and
Yeah.
to get the experience that they're getting. So I'm also concerned that because we don't have an alternative that can quickly take the place of universities today, that the universities will do a little bit or enough to sort of hold themselves over until after COVID is done, and then we may see some change but not enough change. And so I'm still a believer that we need to work outside the system to dramatically improve it, while simultaneously hopefully encouraging the system itself to reform, even though I think it'll do it somewhat slowly.
Mm. Man, these are powerful thoughts, man. Gems. I want to show love to Betty, Mrs. Hart. Oh, ain't that the truth? College is the gatekeeper, which prevents us from our ability to succeed. The tea is piping hot, so she's feeling you on that, man. So I want to show love to Tony, who has a few questions for you. He wants to touch on your thoughts for K through 12 learning. He believes online learning will be easier to adapt for adults versus children. Children rely on parents' ability to be technologically savvy to learn, while adults can learn on their own. Most parents are 26 on average, which means they are millennials. What are your thoughts on this, Gagan?
Yeah, great question, and that's a good stat. I like the 26 on average stat. That was really helpful. Um, I'm not an expert in K through 12. I'll be the first one to admit it. And I am not someone who spends a lot of time outside of my own world in terms of education. So I'm not super knowledgeable in that area. What I am pretty knowledgeable about, I would say, is how incumbents take control and sort of manage systems and ensure a lack of change, which is what I just talked about with universities. So I do not really think that online is the solution to everything
Mm,
with K through 12. I don't think many people do, to be honest. I don't even think that there are a lot of online education companies in K through 12 that are succeeding, or even ones that aren't, who believe that children should just spend all their time on a computer and learn from that. That's not a common thought, actually.
yeah.
But the thought that people have is that our modern institutions, that is our schools, our school unions, both the administrative side and the teacher side, and our state governments, which largely run our schools, are absolutely incapable and have proven to be incapable of improving the system as the world changes. And so technology is simply a wedge to get to students to ensure that we can try to make some change. But I believe personally that true change, the change that probably you're looking for, if you're someone who wants your children to have a much better educational outcome, a much better educational system, is not going to happen unless we change it at the governmental level. And I think that only changes if we remove power away from the people who are currently preventing us from moving forward. So, I subscribe to this newsletter called Govern for California, which I think is incredibly powerful. And it talks about the unions in California, both the prison unions, but also the teachers unions and, various other and the police unions, and how they dramatically, and this is a bipartisan, by the way, or nonpartisan, I should say, nonpartisan. It's not bipartisan. It's a nonpartisan thread, Govern for California, and they talk about how teachers unions are regularly voting against and preventing schools from improving educational outcomes for students. And it's not their fault. It's because they're scared and they don't currently see the value in this. But we as a people have to start to vote in a way that we ask for this kind of change, and to essentially override or ask the teachers unions to vote in favor of things that are helpful to students. And I think that's a huge challenge that we have, and we obviously need to fix it.
Yeah.
So I don't actually think the change is going to happen through the internet. It's only going to happen. Sorry, Tim. It's only going to happen if we change the political system.
Yeah, no, that's actually really a powerful point. And I think it speaks to this really, really huge need for cross-pollination and collaboration between private sector and the public sector, not only at the state level, but also at the governmental level. And I love your point about really taking power away from the people who currently withhold it or preventing that, because often we see digitization, especially in education, as the only thing. But it's going to be a mix of offline and online components that drive that change.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm on Zoom calls. I actually only do like an hour or two of Zoom calls a day. So but there's a reason why I only do that, right? I just basically turned off all meetings or reduced my meeting load dramatically when I quit my last company. And since then, I can't do like, full days meetings all the time. But nobody who's in Zoom calls all day, I've talked to many people who are, like it. Nobody is like, oh yeah, I want to spend the rest of my life just sitting in front of a computer, digitally interacting with people. That's ridiculous. People like the flexibility of being able to work from home on occasion, and there are a lot of times where they would prefer to do a Zoom call because of the convenience of that. But they will replace that. They will also supplement that, or even replace the time that they're not in Zoom calls with in-person interactions in various ways. And I think kids are obviously going to have the same thing. They're going to use their cell phones for certain things, but they're going to want to be in person and learn tact with their fingers.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
Yeah. Much love to Mr. Carnell Tate, who's saying, what are some of the top trends that you are excited about in education that you see happening in the next 1, 5, and 10 years? Gagan, man, he's asking you to think exponentially out.
Yeah. So in the next 5 to 10 years, I think that I'm hoping that we see an acceleration of the rise of alternatives to traditional education. So when I say traditional education, I mean public schools, and including charter schools, anything that's publicly related or funded. I mean universities and colleges, and probably also professional development curriculum that I think is also pretty bad and needs to be improved. So I see an improvement in those things. Now, how do we do that? Well, I think that as we've discussed, companies will utilize technology as a wedge, whether it's their marketing tool or whether it's their delivery mechanism or whether it actually improves outcomes, will be different depending on the sector and the case. But companies will use technology and venture capital really as a wedge to provide alternatives to people that will continue to reduce the share of students who go through K-12, the traditional K-12 system, go through the traditional college system, and will utilize new methods for that. What those methods are, I think, will vary dramatically. So there will be a lot more of, I think one thing that I think is going to be exciting is the rise of micro classrooms. So classrooms that are actually smaller rather than bigger because of the leverage you get via the internet.
Wow.
And the leverage you get via self-organization. So I think that's one thing. Um, I think that we'll have an increase in sort of flipping the classroom, which will be related to this. So I think people will get their content from centralized sources, which, by the way, they always have, right? Textbooks are the same in most states, right? Most state have statewide textbook rules, and the textbooks are generally the same even across most colleges. And so, of course, there's going to be a centralization of the content, but there might also be a centralization of the lesson plans. There might also be a centralization of where people sort of who decides what the assessments are, the new assessments that these lesson plans create. And so it's very possible that we see that centralization, and then we watch people go into smaller groups as they interact with their peers, primarily and maybe through some sort of mentor or TA system. Um, and I think that's going to be a big change in education, is that you'll see more and more students who opt for smaller groups, and that their classroom sizes actually go down because of the leverage you get through centralization of resources.
Powerful. Shout out to Carnell for asking that question, because I think it touches on what can companies do to help address the skills gap too, whether it be starting within K through 12, or really trying to converge that with professional development, rethinking the curriculum around that. So that was a really powerful question, Cardinal. Thank you for asking that. Gagan, while we have you, man, one of the things that we really wanted to talk with you about is a lot of the conversation that's happening around diversity, equity, inclusion, and how organizations can create more equity within their workforce. Would love to have your thoughts on what do you think leaders can do to create that type of environment within their organizations, and share with us a little bit about, some of the things that you did for yourself at Udemy to ensure that you were equitable in how you hired and grew your teams.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I did a much better job at Sprig. At Udemy, I wasn't very aware of it. So Udemy ended up actually doing an amazing job here, from what I know. But most of it was after I left. So I left the company after about 3 years, and the company has had many senior leaders who are of different, different sort of DEI backgrounds. But I haven't been at the company during that time. In recent times, I worked on Sprig, where we did have, I think, a pretty good track record on DEI, given the context of the time that we were in. So, given that it was 2013 to 2017, we had leaders at every, basically any sort of ethnicity or minority that you could name. We had a leader at least in each of them, and the company was probably around, somewhere between 25 and 50%. Led by sort of diversity candidates, or leaders. And I think that there's a few things that I learned along the way, but I'll also say, like, look, the truth is that the way I learned all this is I saw people yelling about things on the internet, and sometimes I wasn't thrilled about the way they did it, but I paid attention anyways. And as I paid attention, I started to read the articles and the thoughts that they were having about it. And then I implemented those changes in my company. So I can be someone, I'm not someone who's going to be the loudest person in the room and who's going to say things in a way that I think sometimes can be very hard to listen to and hard to agree with. But I will say that those movements that were happening well before, BLM, the most recent BLM outrage, and the Me Too movement that happened in 2000, call it 2016 or 15. But before that, there were other movements about diversity in tech, and it was being talked about. And I read the articles that people were talking about, and I tried to implement things. So an example of something I implemented, I read that women are less likely to ask for raises, and that this is a contributing factor to people to inequity in compensation. Of course, so that's two things. It's one, that there is an inequity in compensation, and there's the proverbial pay gap. But two, that at least in part that pay gap is not solely driven by people in power not giving people the same wage, but also driven in part by cultural faux pas or challenges associated with asking for raises. So I started to deconstruct the system of how people get raises in companies and realize, look, it's better, at least in my company where I'm willing to put effort into this, to be proactive about raises. So I created this policy that I never publicly talked about. Actually, I did not write this down. Nobody in the company really knew about it except for my head of HR eventually. And I basically just every quarter looked at the salaries of everyone in the company. And I checked to see whether or not I thought there were imbalances. And I tried to naturally, and not imbalances based just on race or gender, just imbalances, period. Like, oh, this person clearly is operating at a level that's significantly higher than this person. Why are they getting paid the same? Oh, okay. Let me, and I would proactively give people raises and proactively. So I made a rule to myself, or sort of a guideline, that if I was proactively giving out raises or title bumps or changes in equity, that I was doing a good job. And if someone came to me and asked me for a raise and they deserved it, so I ended up agreeing with them, then I knew I was making a mistake. I knew I was wrong, right? Because I should have preempted this if someone's already done it. So by doing that, I think I was able, and I don't really know because, of course, everyone's going to have an opinion about how much they should be paid. But I think I did a pretty good job of balancing the pay gap in our company. And I think that, from a metrics perspective, you could look at the pay gap in our company, and we didn't have anyone who was paid below or above their market as a result of me regularly checking the pay. And of course, eventually my head of HR would also do this. And so the two of us would do this quarterly, roughly quarterly. And that's an example, right? Another example is I am personally got funny story. I applied to Google as a undergraduate from college, and I got accepted. So I went through all the hiring process. I went to the final round. I went in person to Google. They did the whole song and dance, and then that night a recruiter called me and said, "Hey, you got the job. We want you to join Google, but there are a few more processes before you get your offer. And so we're going to go through this process, and we'd like you to send a few more pieces of paperwork." So one of the pieces of paperwork that they asked you to send in is your college transcript, which included, for me, I graduated fairly quickly, and so did not always, and I was not very studious. I was not very studious, to be honest. Like, I didn't care about school at all. So I had two C pluses on my college transcript. And 5 weeks or 6 weeks later, after not hearing from them and being like in this weird rigmarole with Google, I eventually got a call saying, "Sorry, actually, we have this hiring process," and they had already explained this to me in the past, but they have this hiring process where they basically take your packet, is what they called it. It was like all of the interview notes from your candidacy, your resume, your college transcripts, etc., and they like circulate this amongst the executives at Google. Like, so it goes up to hiring committee after hiring committee, and eventually probably like up to some C-level exec. I don't think it was CEO, but maybe every hire still had to get in front of the C level executive. And at some point in one of those hiring committees, I got rejected. So someone who never met me, even though all my interviews said yes, sort of rejected me. And it could be because I went to Berkeley and not Stanford and Harvard. I don't know. Berkeley is a pretty good school, so that sounds ridiculous. But I know that Google at one time did care and did find there to be a value in being at Stanford over a school like Berkeley. So I know that that's true. I know that they cared about GPA. And so I don't know what happened. But I know that afterwards I was pretty upset about it and felt like I was as good as any candidate and did not feel like that was a really reasonable process. And so I've always had a problem with what I call elitist Silicon Valley hiring, and I felt like that was a pretty elitist thing that Google was doing. It turns out that Google has since recanted this philosophy and has realized that this is a bad thing. Yeah. And so I think to some extent there's some vindication there. And so I developed a philosophy myself because I felt like I was being profiled. Of course, I'm Indian, so many people would say I wasn't being profiled, but I felt like I was being profiled for my grades, and inaccurately. And so I developed this thought process of I really didn't care what school you went to. What I cared about, and so I never really looked at someone's school when hiring. What I cared about was two things. One, you still had to have the skills that I wanted for the job. Yeah. So obviously, if you didn't go to school, it was less likely that you would have those skills. You might have those skills, but it was less likely. So I'm still going to be biased towards people who are in the system. I know that that's true. But number two, I'm going to look at lines and not dots. So rather than looking at where you are right now. I'm going to look at where you came from and where you went to. So if you grew up in, my co-founders grew up in a one-room schoolhouse in southeastern Turkey, which is a pretty sort of, flyover state sort of part of Turkey, right? And they ended up becoming like number two, number three in the world in math. They were really, really smart. If you're able to go from a one-room schoolhouse in Turkey to being one of the smartest engineers I've ever met, I think of that as far more impressive than someone who went to Stanford and ended up getting a job at Facebook or Google, which is fine. But if you then went to Palo Alto High School, I'm like, what did you really do? You just did the average of what people who came from Palo Alto High School did. And that's great. And I actually think you're probably really smart and I might be friends with you, but I'm not impressed. And so what ended up happening was I ended up starting to hire people and noticing that I was hiring people who were more likely to have come up through the system in a way that was a little bit different. And that's the types of things that I do with DE&I. And I'm still looking for a lot more. So if you're someone who's listening to this and thinking, wow, Gagan's still in 2017 or 2016 thinking, sure, send me links and articles and I'd love to read them and learn about them. But I think that philosophy that I had helped me have a more diverse team, because essentially I was looking at the underlying reasons that people think about diversity and what's good and bad, and then trying to fix it. Instead of just saying, hey, I want 50% of my leadership team to be diverse. And I think that's a blunt instrument that is not, I don't like it at all. So I'm not interested in quotas. I don't have a problem with affirmative action in universities. I'm sort of neutral on it. But from the perspective of actually like my own company, I'm not going to look at someone who's a woman or who's black or Latino or whatever. I'm not going to look at someone from whatever race or ethnicity and say you're going to be in my company because of it, or you're not going to be in my company because of it. What I'm going to do is understand why the system is biased against that group of people, go to the first principles of what creates that bias, and do my best to make an improvement in that. And I also think the flip side is, sorry, I could talk about this forever, but the flip side is the flip side is I think that because of this first principles learning, because some percentage of the imbalance between any given sect of society, and forget race and gender, this is also true just if you grew up with lower income parents. So let's just talk about income. If your parents had a lower income than someone else's parents, like my parents had a lower income than maybe the other people in my neighborhood, for example, I have a lower chance of success. But it also means that I got probably on average a lower education, and therefore I might actually not be as qualified for the job. It's complicated. You can't just expect us to start hiring everyone who's from a lower income at the same level that we hire people from a higher income. But what you can do is say, look, I also don't want it to work against you in a way that's unnatural or unfair. And as a hiring manager, I can look at it and say, well, if you were able to come from a lower income and do this, that might actually be more impressive than someone who came from a higher income and made only like a marginal improvement on that. And so I can be somewhat, I can improve the situation, but I cannot fix the situation. I cannot go out there and immediately just change the way the world, and I think it takes generations for this to change, but I can become less of a part of the problem, and that's my goal.
Man, Gaga, I think that's so powerful, man. And, I think I love your approach around first principles thinking and really touching at the root cause of what causes bias in the hiring process. And, you're one of the leaders that, even just based on the conversations that we've had, that I believe is doing a tremendous, great job around it and thinking about it from a much more inclusive and a fundamental lens, whereas a lot of, leaders and businesses, they just kind of throw out quotas and they fail at meeting those quotas. And I think, really we're going to see more change at the team level and really thinking about it from a first principle standpoint. So, I think you're doing a great job, man. Want to show love to Michael, who's saying, great point of looking at the journey to help with your assessment. I also call that the grit journey. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love the term grit journey. That's great. I'm going to use that.
Yeah.
I look at the grit journey of someone's life, and I think that's a huge indicator of whether or not they're going to be, a valuable asset to a team. And again, like when you hire someone, you're looking at potential because they won't want to do the same thing they did in their last job.
Yep.
So, by virtue of looking at their potential, you are naturally going to want to know, well, what's the slope of their curve? What is the slope of their growth curve? And so, if they started at a different spot, their growth curve is probably, that helps put context around a growth curve.
Yeah. Shout out to David who also say, man, wow. That's very insightful, everything that you said. With that said, Gagan, thank you so much for joining us on another live episode of Guide Live. Gagan, what's one powerful takeaway that you have for our community who is currently surviving and thriving through these tough times, man?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously an extremely challenging time, and I don't want to take anything away from that. If you've had days that are tough, I mean, I've had many days where I've just taken 2 days off, right? I'm lucky enough to be able to do that. But when I say off, you can still work. Like I might have still done calls or whatever, but I just wasn't my best. And at the very least, emotionally, I gave myself the day off, right? So I might have still had to do work. I might have still have gone in and answered emails. But at the very least, in my head, I'm thinking, all right, you're just not going to be the best today, and that's okay. And I bounced back quickly because I gave myself a pass because I knew that that was part of it. Um, and so I totally think that you need to do that, and everyone should. At the same time, recognize that things are changing faster, and for anyone who's sort of entrepreneurial, and by watching this podcast, you are by definition entrepreneurial because you're doing something a lot of people won't do, which is learn and actively learn and listen and try to apply that to your life. So anyone who's listening to this, in my opinion, is already a step ahead. It's time to take advantage of that. And things are going to change, and the new world is going to need new things. They're going to need new systems. They're going to need new companies. They're going to need new skills. And if you are moving towards that, then while this time might be difficult, over the next, call it 5 to 10 years, if you position yourself well, you will be able to take a lot of advantage of that. So that's my advice to you is if you can get through this emotionally and personally and financially. And then the other thing is, look at the worst things that have happened 50 to 100 years ago. World War II, what it was like in the Spanish flu, which was, where they didn't have all this information and access to technology and access to the ability to work from home, et cetera. And I'll say that this is still actually very much a first world version of a national disaster, in the sense that we're very lucky to live in a time where we know what's going on. We have the ability to shelter in place. Many of us will still have food on our tables and still have a roof over our heads. And I think about the people for which that's not true in developing nations. And if you're that, I'm here with you. But if you have access to internet, you probably have access to a roof over your head and food. That'd be my guess. And so I'd say, be grateful for that, because there's people out there. I mean, I think about the people I visited over the last couple of years traveling, and I worry about what's going on for them and what happened 50 or 100 years ago when people went through stuff like this and didn't have what we have today.
So be grateful, have some perspective, and take advantage of the entrepreneurial opportunities during this time. Gagan, man, thank you so much for joining us, man.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it.
We definitely need to have you on for a future episode, man. What do you think, brother?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother, man. Talk to you soon, bro.
All right. Bye.
Peace. Man, powerful episode. Please definitely make sure you connect with Gagan on LinkedIn, Twitter, and his website. Super wealth of information. One of the greatest guys in the industry and in the business. With that said, we are gradually expanding our beta. Much love to Betty. Much love to Betty and everyone that was joining us today. Angel, Joel, Francesca. Appreciate you, Cardinal. Thank you so much for tuning in. And Andrea, hope you enjoyed this episode. Once again, please share this episode with your network, your teammates, your friends, whoever, and let them know that we are currently in beta for Guide. So if they want to early access to Guide for their workforce or for themselves, check out guideapp.co/early access, guideapp.co/early access. Much love to Tim. Much love to Betty. Gonna give you the last word. She says, Tim and Gagan, this is such enjoyable and important discussion. Thank you for sharing and keeping it 100. 100. Betty, much love to you. Thank you for always tuning in. You are top notch. Appreciate you. With that said, happy Monday, you all. I am going to sign off with my favorite words, wishing you peace, love, and abundance. Peace, y'all. Talk soon.